You know, every government has to walk this incredibly fine line. On one side, they have a duty to keep us safe, right? But on the other, they have to protect our freedoms. Today, we're going to zero in on that line, that razor's edge where government surveillance stops being about security and starts violating the Constitution itself. So let's just jump right into the big question. It's not really about if the government should be allowed to conduct surveillance. It's about where the limits are. When does the act of watching its own people, of gathering intelligence, stop being legitimate and start becoming unconstitutional targeting? I mean, think about it. On one hand, the government has a totally legitimate job to do, preventing attacks, stopping crime, all that stuff. But on the other hand, the Constitution guarantees us things like freedom of speech and equal protection. And these two duties, they're in this constant, really delicate dance with each other. To figure out where that line is drawn today, we've got to look at how the courts have defined it over the years. So, we're going to follow a trail through 3 landmark legal battles that literally built the rules. And then we're going to take those rules and dive headfirst into the secret files of a real and, frankly, chilling government program. Okay, let's start with the clearest standard there is. This is the legal equivalent of a bright neon sign. You just can't miss it. The case that drew this bright line was Loving v. Virginia. You might have heard of it. Back in 1958, Mildred Jeter, a black woman, and Richard Loving, a white man, got married. And for that, they were arrested. The question that went all the way to the Supreme Court was simple but huge. Can a state pass a law that makes something a crime specifically based on race? And the court came back with a big, loud no. This gave us the principle of facial discrimination. Basically, if a law is discriminatory on its face, meaning the words written right there in the law create different rules for different people, it's unconstitutional. Full stop. The court said laws like that have to face the most rigid scrutiny, which is basically legal speak for almost impossible to justify. And the Chief Justice at the time, Earl Warren, put it perfectly. He said that freedom belongs to the individual, not the state. So this gives us our first test for any government action. Does it openly, in its own text, discriminate? If it does, it's out. But, it's not always that obvious, right? What happens when a law is written in perfectly neutral language, but out in the real world, it seems to have a discriminatory effect? Well, this is where that bright line starts to get a little fuzzy. And this is exactly the puzzle the Supreme Court tackled in a case called Washington v. Davis. It was about a test given to police recruits in D.C. Now, the test itself was totally neutral. Everyone took the same one. But way more black applicants failed it than white applicants. So they argued that this unequal result, this impact, was proof that the test was unconstitutional. The court, however, said no. A discriminatory result isn't enough. They created what's called the intent requirement. This means you have to prove that the government intended to discriminate. And wow, did that set a much higher bar. Just think about it for a second. How hard is it to prove what someone was thinking? It's not enough to show a policy is harmful. You have to prove the government wanted it to be harmful. So that leads us to our next problem, and our most modern standard. If you have to prove intent, but there's no law that says, let's discriminate, and no smoking gun memo that says, our goal is discrimination, how in the world do you ever prove it? Well, the answer is you have to look at what people are actually doing. The case that really cracked this nut was Floyd v. City of New York. This was the big challenge to the NYPD's stop and frisk program. Now, the policy itself was neutral on paper. It said officers could stop someone based on reasonable suspicion. The question was, how is that neutral policy being applied on the streets, day in and day out? And here's the breakthrough. The court in Floyd said, okay, you can meet that high bar for intent by showing a clear pattern of discriminatory application. In other words, you don't need a written confession. You can let the actions, the data, speak for themselves. If the pattern is strong enough, the court can infer that the intent was there all along. So how did they actually prove that pattern? Well, they brought a mountain of evidence. First, they had statistics, just overwhelming numbers showing that Black and Latino New Yorkers were being stopped at wildly disproportionate rates. Second, they showed that institutional pressure to make quotas was leading to tons of stops without actual legal suspicion. And third, they had officers testify that, race was a factor in who they decided to stop. Okay, so let's recap. We have our legal toolkit now, right? We've got the bright line against facial discrimination from Loving. We've got the super high bar of proving intent from Washington v. Davis. And we have the modern workaround, proving a pattern of practice from Floyd. So now, let's put this toolkit to the test with one of the most infamous surveillance programs in U.S. history. This right here, this is a direct quote from an internal FBI memo. COINTELPRO, which stood for Counterintelligence Program, wasn't just about preventing crime. This memo makes it crystal clear that one of its primary goals was political. They wanted to stop a powerful black leader from emerging. And when you look at who they targeted, it's just staggering. Yeah, there were militant groups like the Black Panthers, but they also went after Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent SCLC, student anti-war groups, and even the women's liberation movement. The program did target some violent white groups like the KKK, but its main focus, by far, was on political dissent from the left. And this document, this just drives the point home. This comes from the Senate investigation into the program. Look at who's on this list for intelligence gathering. The NAACP, the SCLC, the Women's Lib movement. These aren't criminal organizations. These are groups of American citizens engaged in free speech and political organizing, things that are supposed to be protected by the Constitution. So let's apply that first legal test we talked about from Loving, Virginia. You've got an official FBI directive telling agents to neutralize groups that it specifically labels Black nationalist hate groups. By explicitly targeting groups based on their racial identity and their political views, this is a textbook example of facial discrimination. It's written right there in the directive. So how exactly did they try to neutralize these groups? One of their biggest tools was the use of informants. And these weren't just people listening in. Declassified documents revealed there was a whole playbook. Step 1, get inside lawful groups. Step 2, report on their private activities. Step 3, actively try to create paranoia and make them fight with each other. And sometimes, even step 4, provoke them into doing something illegal. I mean, listen to this. This is a quote from a former FBI agent talking about their operations against the American Indian movement. He straight up admitted that the goal of creating distrust was to get activists to turn on each other, saying, "We wanted them to kill each other." This is not about stopping crime. This is about destroying a political movement from the inside. COINTELPRO was officially shut down in 1971 after it was exposed. But the legal principles and that fundamental tension between our security and our liberty, that's as real today as it was then. Which brings us to our final and maybe most important question. Think about it. The entire legal framework we just walked through was built in a world of wiretaps and people in trench coats. Today, we're dealing with facial recognition, AI, constant social media monitoring, and the collection of massive amounts of data. The challenge for all of us, for courts, for lawmakers, for citizens, is figuring out how these old lines, the bright ones and the blurry ones, apply to a world that the founders of our country could never have even dreamed of. And where we decide to draw that line is going to define what freedom looks like in the 21st century.